Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So how does God work in the world? If you were following the example of the best-known stories in the Bible, you'd have to say that God works through supernatural events and big world occurrences, like the parting of the Red Sea, pestilence on the enemies of the people, earthquakes, fire and brimstone, big dramatic stuff. But is that really how most of us experience God at work in the world on a day-to-day basis? Is that what would normally happen to us? There's an old saying that says a coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. A coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. And I think that's the thinking that often happens in our own lives. And it's also what we see at work here in the book of Ruth. Now, last week we were introduced to Naomi from Bethlehem, who was married with 2 sons. The family moved to Moab because of a famine, at which point her husband died. Her 2 sons married Moabite women, but then the 2 sons died too without having any children. And now Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law decide to return to Israel. She urges her daughters-in-law to return to their families. One does, but Ruth refuses not to leave her. Ruth makes this powerful statement of her desire and commitment to Naomi, regardless of what. Your people will be my people, your God will be my God. At which point Naomi stops trying to convince her to change her mind. They arrive together in Bethlehem. And of course the people are excited to see Naomi. It's you, Naomi. But she tells them that she is no longer Naomi, which means pleasant in Hebrew. Instead, she is Mara, which means bitter. Naomi believes that once she was full, but now she believes that God has left her empty. Influenced by the patriarchal values of the time, Naomi thinks security is only to be had through a husband and through having sons, which of course she doesn't have either of those. Nevertheless, the chapter from last week ends with the barley harvest just beginning, and Ruth, her faithful daughter-in-law, by her side. We're left with seeds of hope. In our reading for today, faithful Ruth, who is once again demonstrating Hesed, goes out to glean in the fields. Now, Old Testament law requires farmers to allow this. Gleaners pick up stray stalks of grain. It's an important part of the welfare system of the Old Testament. And while she is out there gleaning, she meets Boaz, a farmer and a relative of her late father-in-law. I don't know about you, but it's frightening really how casual the references are to violence against women here. Boaz commands his young man not to assault her. Apparently she wouldn't have been safe otherwise. Boaz takes a shining to her, and he gives her a big lunch and makes sure that she has enough to eat, and makes sure she has water to drink, and has his men leave out extra grain for her when they're bundling up the sheaves. She's able to get back to Naomi at the end of the day with leftovers from lunch and a large quantity of grain, maybe about 30 pounds of grain. Not bad for a day's work. Naomi is ecstatic. Her despair seems to finally be lifting. Before she had made all this talk about being bitter and about being empty and hopeless, but now she's talking about the blessings of God. Her mentality is starting to change. Now, last week I talked about hesed, the Hebrew word for steadfast love and loyalty. Hesed is really love in action. Normally in the Hebrew Bible, hesed is demonstrated by God's great love for God's people. But last week, we saw hesed demonstrated in Ruth's love and loyalty to her mother-in-law. Again, this isn't something that Ruth owes Naomi. Hesed goes above and beyond any legal or moral requirement. And this week we see Boaz, who recognizes Ruth's great loyalty to her mother-in-law, and then he demonstrates hesed for Ruth as well. Boaz goes above and beyond his legal requirements to Ruth. It's almost like he sees Ruth doing it, and he feels obligated or maybe inspired to do the same. He makes sure that she's safe while she's gleaning. He makes sure she has enough water to drink. He makes sure she has a good lunch and that she has plenty of grain to take home. And was this all a coincidence? That Boaz just happened to show up at the right time to meet Ruth? The text doesn't say that God somehow made this happen. In fact, in the book of Ruth, there's only one place where the text specifically says God makes something happen, and that won't happen until chapter 4, so we've got a couple weeks before that comes. So is this a coincidence? Or is this one of those miracles where God prefers to remain anonymous? The text really leaves it open for us and for interpretation. So we have hesed, faithful love, steadfast love, loyalty. Here's another word for you, goel. In the ancient world, there wasn't many social safety nets. Extended families were expected to care for each other. And that's still the case in some places in the world. Some of those folks that help refugees transition to life in the United States have to explain to people that actually in our country, if you don't pay your rent, you will lose your housing. In some cultures, that won't ever happen. Even if you don't have enough money, they won't kick you out of your place. Because there's still this strong understanding that you're supposed to care for each other. I don't know how landlords make money in those countries, but it is what it is. So they actually have to help people when they move to the United States. So when a person was down on their luck, a relative was supposed to help them out. If the struggling person had to sell their property, the kinsman is charged with buying it to prevent the property from falling outside of the family's possession. This kinsman would redeem their struggling relative. If a man died without sons, a brother was supposed to marry the widow and have sons for his brother. The term often used is kinsman redeemer. Goel is the Hebrew word for that. And it's another important piece of the biblical welfare system. Chapter 2 is setting up Boaz as the Goel for Naomi and Ruth. Ruth was conveniently gleaning in Boaz's field. Boaz just happened to conveniently stroll through the field while she was there. And now we just have to wait until next week to see what happens next. When we started this chapter, despite all the promising circumstances, a barley harvest, the presence of Ruth, the welcome from her community, Naomi was forlorn, despondent. she didn't have any hope for herself. She was holding on to that patriarchal message that says she needs a husband and sons for security in this world. And she doesn't have either of those. She just has Ruth. And what good is that, she seems to be saying. Now in today's chapter, we start seeing those hints of hope begin to take shape. Ruth, in her faithfulness, goes out into the fields to gather food for herself and for Naomi. We start seeing some of the barley that we were reading about last week. Sorry, folks, people in Asia and Europe had not discovered corn yet. They hadn't reached the United States where they were growing corn in droves back then. And then Boaz shows up supervising his workers, maybe. We're not even sure why he's there. The text doesn't tell us. But the light of hope grows even brighter as he is drawn to Ruth for her loyalty to Naomi. Again, coincidence or miracle? I think that the book of Ruth speaks a bit more closely to our experience than many other biblical texts do. As I mentioned in my introduction, most of the time we don't experience God at work in grand and supernatural ways. Now don't get me wrong, those do happen. Some of you here today may have had profound religious experiences that revealed God to you. Some of you may have experienced healing, from illness. Some of you may have experienced a miracle that rescued you from harm. I'm not saying those things don't happen. I know they do. I'm just saying that isn't normally how we experience things on a day-to-day basis, on every day. The book of Ruth talks about things that we can all understand. We understand loss. We understand grief. Heck, we even understand despair. We know what it's like to see no future for yourself. And like Naomi, we might ignore those little seeds of hope that are planted right in front of us. We don't always see those coincidences where God is at work. Remember, a coincidence is a miracle which God prefers to remain anonymous. I think about, it's been about 9 years ago. Actually, it was 9 years ago in June, now that I think about it. You know, I got a call from a phone call, not a call, a phone call from a local church in Spokane, and they were looking for a pulpit supply. And I was like, how did you get my name? They weren't even in the UCC, they were Disciples of Christ. And they're like, well, you know, Disciples of Christ and UCC share names, and so that's how they got my name. And I was like, well, that's weird. So I went out there, and I preached a sermon, and they liked it, so they asked me to come back for a few more pulpit supply. And eventually, they're like, well, we don't have a pastor. Would you be interested in being our pastor? And I was like, okay, might as well. I mean, I didn't know what my chances were, but I put my name in. And then they voted to call me as their pastor. I was surprised. But that all happened in this odd, coincidental way. Well, was that a coincidence? Or was that the work of God? I think a little bit more recently, as I'm looking at different church profiles and where churches are looking for ministers across the country. You know, I started in Washington. I couldn't find a church in Washington. Then I extended my circle to Idaho and Oregon and even Montana. Couldn't get something there. So then I extended a little bit further to Northern California. And again, couldn't get something. So finally I was like, well, why not Iowa? So I looked at Iowa. And there was this little listing that said Bethany. And I was like, well, that's interesting. It's in a place called Baxter. And we know how that turned out. And again, is that a coincidence or is that a miracle? And I'm sure you have moments in your life that work that same way. Was it a coincidence or was it a miracle? We don't always see those coincidences where God is at work. Like Naomi, sometimes we are so despondent we can't see what's right in front of our faces. You know, as Naomi is going on and on and on about how she's all alone and she has nobody with her, you can almost imagine Ruth thinking, what am I, chopped liver? You know, she's actually saying these things to Ruth. She can't see Ruth right in front of her. You know, she couldn't see that the barley harvest was just beginning. She couldn't see that her community was so excited to have her back. All she could see was her loss and her grief. And we can identify with that. We know what that's like. If we haven't been in that situation, we know plenty of other people that have been, where they just can't see that new life that is right in front of us because we're so stuck on things in a certain way. You know, Naomi couldn't imagine a future for herself without a husband and sons. But in the end, she didn't need those things for security. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So as we go out this week, be looking for those little moments in our lives, those little coincidences where God is at work. When we feel lost, when we feel like we have nothing, when we question whether or not we have a future, perhaps realize as you're complaining to somebody about those things that you actually have somebody to complain to. And that's not an insignificant thing. And that you have people around you. I mean, heck, if you live in Baxter, I suspect that if anybody knows you are in need, that mysterious things will probably end up on your porch, and you won't even know where they came from. People provide us with all sorts of amazing things. Need can be met by surprising places. And those coincidences